This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 1.4 on the American Revolution. And so from where we left off, things have reached a kind of a culmination, and the revolution is now inevitable. The first move of the war, as most of us know, or as many of us know, is in the spring of 1775. The British have received intelligence on two things. One, that the Committee of Safety has been stockpiling arms in preparation for an insurrection, and they've been stockpiling them in an area west of Boston called Lexington and Concord, two towns called Lexington and Concord. And secondly, that the wanted criminals, John Hancock, who is in charge of the Committee on Safety, and Samuel Adams, who is in command of the Sons of Liberty, are hiding out in Lexington and Concord. And so the British will launch a small force designed to take the stockpile of arms and capture Hancock and Adams. And of course, this brings up the very famous and inaccurate ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere was one of many riders that rode out of Boston to warn both to warn Adams and Hancock and the colonials that were assembled in Lexington and Concord that the British were coming. And they had multiple riders because they literally went to every little hamlet, every little village near Boston to tell the people the British were coming, because from these villages would be rather hastily assembled small militia bands, okay, that would be designed to harass the British forces as they marched along. And in fact, Paul Revere is one of the few riders that gets captured. And in point of fact, he gets captured because at the time of the operation, which is in the middle of the night, Paul Revere's boozed up pretty good. Paul Revere was a notorious drunk, and he actually falls off his horse and gets captured by the British. The most famous of them is William Dawes. He does the lion's share of it. He's the one that actually makes it to Lexington and Concord, and warns the sons, principally the Sons of Liberty, that the British are coming. And what the Americans are going to do is not they don't deceive themselves into believing that they have sufficient force to fully engage the British force coming out against Lexington and Concord. What they do instead is a long-running series between Boston and Lexington, a long-running series of very small guerrilla hit-and-run operations. And so what they'll do is they'll assemble in the woods, fire a couple of rounds at the British. As the British prepare for an engaged battle, the American militia group will fall back. The British will then continue on their march, and then another militia group will hit them. And this will go all the way to Lexington until the British realize that they're in danger. With all these militias that have been appearing spontaneously around them, the British are in danger of encirclement, and they're principally concerned that they're going to lose control over the bridge that crosses the Charles River that will lead them back into Boston. And so they ultimately abandon their objective to get Lexington and Concord. Hancock and Adams get away scot-free. The stockpile of arms is safe. The British make it back. There's a small engagement by that bridge, and the British make it back into Boston. But it's not a pitched battle like we're going to see later on in the war. It's a series of harassment assaults by a poorly trained, undisciplined colonial militia, literally a collection of rabble, who hastily assemble and launch a series of harassment assaults on the British. Shortly thereafter, the Second Continental Congress will form. And more or less simultaneously with this, in the late spring and early summer, Benedict Arnold, famous to history as the American traitor, but actually one of the best generals in the early stages of the Revolutionary War, probably the most ambitious general, and Nathan Hale will, in a complete surprise operation, and unbeknownst to any of the people that are in Boston, it won't be under the command. It will Arnold and Hale will design this operation on their own. They assemble a group of about 800 militiamen in northern New York, in the Adirondack area, and they will, by surprise, show up at the British fort at Ticonderoga, which is very lightly defended. They have fewer than 200 men there. And they actually surprised the British entirely. In fact, the commander of the British is caught literally with his pants down. He's caught in his undershirt, in his night clothes, in the middle of the night. And he's forced to surrender the position at Ticonderoga, which will have tremendous impact immediately, because in addition to the British losing control over the Hudson there, they also lose the stockpile of arms and, more importantly, the guns, the heavy cannon at Fort Ticonderoga. Hale and Arnold will then ship those guns east to Boston to participate in what is rapidly developing as the Siege of Boston, which we'll see in a minute here. This will also be the foundation of the Continental Army. Although you're going to notice that in the early parts of the war, I'll refer to the American forces as the Colonial Army, because to me there's a significant difference between the hodgepodge of undisciplined militias that develop early in the war, and the actual army that will fight from 1778 onwards. And we'll see why that is. It has to do with Valley Forge. And so really at this point I refer to it as the Colonial Army, because this differentiates. What we have here is a loose collection of poorly organized and poorly trained local militias, rather than a unified, coordinated army. They will issue the Declaration of Causes and Necessities to take up arms, which is effectively the declaration of war against Britain. And George Washington, this is kind of a mysterious thing. We've heard of George before. We've seen him before. We noted that he did not acquit himself particularly well, either during the French and Indian War, either in the engagement at Fort Necessity, where he got himself trapped, or in the Battle of Monongahela, where mysteriously he was the only officer associated with the British forces that escaped unscathed. I'm still a little wondering about that. But at any rate, okay. He'll be selected as commander-in-chief. Now, this is a somewhat mysterious... He hasn't, by any means, through his experience or through his record as a military commander, demonstrated the kind of ability necessary to command an army. There are a couple of things. One, he's really the only American general that is familiar with British tactics, having served in the colonial militia of Virginia and participated in the early stages of the French and Indian War. So that he's got going for him. And two, he's really the only commander that's seen actual combat. So that's one thing. But moreover, the more important reason is a political one. As I've mentioned before, the southern colonies are not particularly well disposed. They're not particularly interested in an all-out rebellion against British authority. Okay, for reasons that we've talked about before. The southern colonies are doing okay under the mercantile system. They don't begin to have the kind of grievances that New England does. Okay, they weren't the subject of the coercive acts. Okay, they weren't the subject of the main British crackdown on the American insurrection, and so they're not particularly interested in it. In fact, there will be a raging debate at the Declaration of Independence regarding it. To placate the southern colonies and to get them on board, it's decided to place, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, to place a southerner there. Okay? Well, the only southerner with any military experience whatsoever is George Washington. And so he gets the position kind of by default. He's the only southerner with military experience. Granted, he hasn't done very well, but nonetheless, he'll be placed in command, excuse me, in an effort to kind of keep the South on board with the revolution. Now, the second engagement is going to be the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually is the Battle of Breed's Hill. And we'll just look at the strategic position. The British have fallen back to Boston, okay, and are now engaged here. What you see, these are artillery positions, fortified positions. The British are in kind of a strategic disadvantage here. The American militias, and again, these are loosely coordinated militias, have been assembling now for weeks. This is going to be June of 1775. So this is 2 months after Lexington and Concord. And the Americans now have about 15,000 men in position surrounding Boston. Gage, who is at this point in charge, Howe hasn't arrived yet to take command of forces, will realize the difficult position he's in. The British fleet is in Boston Harbor. If the Americans are able to take up the positions here at Bunker and Breed's Hill and over here at Dorchester Heights, they'll be able to pick off the British fleet. And that will make it impossible for the British to maintain their position in Boston. Not to mention that the Americans can then just lob artillery into Boston and eventually crack the defenses. And so what the British are going to decide to do is they see two operations. They're going to need to take Dorchester Heights and essentially Bunker Hill. Now you'll notice the position. Bunker Hill is further to the west, Breed's Hill further to the east. The British want to take Bunker Hill because that gives them the high ground here, which will prevent the Americans from taking this strategically advantageous position. They want to take Dorchester Heights because this will give their fleet free access to Boston Harbor. Okay. And again, this is what we're going to have a series of throughout this lecture. This is a screenshot that's taken from that U.S. History Animated, historyanimated.com. If you just Google historyanimated.com, you'll come to this site, and it goes over the tactical details involved in the battles, which are really quite interesting. But what I'm going to focus on here is the strategies employed. The Americans will take up a defensive position. Now, they take up the defensive position in the middle of the night, so they kind of make a mistake. They mean to set up a defensive position on Bunker Hill, which will allow them to assault the British as they come towards Breed's Hill, or off of Breed's Hill towards Bunker Hill. But in fact, they end up setting up at Breed's Hill, and it's an untenable position, so they'll have to fall back to Bunker Hill. The British will launch a series of assaults against Bunker Hill, none of which are particularly successful. We have to remember that the British have the Americans have the advantageous position. And we also want to remember that while George Washington has recently been placed in command of the Continental Army, he hasn't arrived in Boston yet. So George isn't here, which is probably why the Americans will at least hold their own here. Is because they're not under the command of Washington. What we're going to see is when Washington takes command, the Americans demonstrate a singular inability to hold their own against the British. But at any rate, we'll get to that in a minute. The British launch a series of assaults. The guns from Fort Ticonderoga, which I just mentioned, after Arnold and Hale have taken Ticonderoga, haven't arrived in the Boston area yet. Okay, they're months away, in point of fact. And so the Americans have insufficient supplies to maintain their position on Bunker Hill. They will literally run out of ammunition. At the end of the battle, they'll actually be picking up stones from the ground and loading them into their muskets and firing those in an attempt to keep the British at bay. This will, of course, be unsuccessful, and the British will ultimately take Bunker Hill, which gives them a strategic position. Now, they'll abandon that position when the guns from Fort Ticonderoga do arrive, because they're much heavier artillery, and the British will be forced to abandon that position, and ultimately they'll abandon Boston entirely. Because as the Americans close in around them, and once the guns from Fort Ticonderoga arrive, the British realize that Boston is an untenable position. Their fleet is constantly threatened by American artillery. They never do take Dorchester Heights, and so the guns from Fort Ticonderoga can be positioned on Dorchester Heights, and the British fleet in Boston Harbor can be picked off like sitting ducks, which will make logistical support of the British position in Boston impossible. And so when Howe arrives, William Howe will arrive and be commander of British forces for the early stage of the war. His decision is to abandon Boston. And the British will, in fact, evacuate Boston with an orderly retreat and fall back to Nova Scotia. Now, while all this is going on in Boston, and the guns are being moved. We have this map here. Here's Fort Ticonderoga, okay, which Hale and Arnold had taken roughly simultaneously with the Battle of Bunker Hill, a little bit before that, about a month before. While the guns are being transferred across the Green Mountains towards Boston to participate in the siege there, in an absolutely bizarre and extraordinarily daring undertaking, Arnold and Montgomery, who was coming to command of the militia in the Adirondacks, decide upon an absolutely bizarre operation. Bizarre and ill-fated, but nonetheless demonstrating daring, particularly on the part of Benedict Arnold, who was Arnold was actually a logistical master. And this demonstrates his logistical mastery. The idea behind it is that Montgomery is going to march up along Lake Champlain. He'll use boats to cross the lake and assault the very lightly defended British position in Canada, seeking to seize Montreal. Arnold, for his part, will by land march over to the coast, sail up, and then march up the Kennebec River through the woodlands of Maine, and assault Quebec, which again is a lightly defended position. We've talked about that, and we've seen the position back in our discussion of the French and Indian War. And what Arnold is intending to do is an absolutely gargantuan logistical feat. Okay, he's an army of about 1,000 men, and he's planning on taking this army of 1,000 men and marching through the thick woodlands of Maine to come up on the south coast of the St. Lawrence, then cross it and take Quebec. Okay, this is a logistics nightmare to be able to do this. Okay, just maintaining supplies for the army, and in fact, by the time he gets to Quebec, his army has dwindled to about 600 men, 400 of them turning around because there's just not enough food to feed them. Okay, so it's a very difficult undertaking. Montgomery, for his part, will have a little bit easier going, but not much easier going. He'll seize Fort Saint-Jean and Fort Chambly from the very lightly defended British positions there and make it across to Montreal, at which point Carleton will move back to Quebec. Montgomery will come apart, take Montreal, and then march towards Quebec. But by the time they get Quebec, the American forces are beleaguered. They're short on supplies, short on ammunition. It's been a long march in a hot summer, and so they'll just abandon the undertaking. But at any rate, it demonstrates the daring do of the Americans. Politically, at this point, this is now we've now crossed into the winter of 75 and 76. The Americans will assemble in the spring. The Continental Congress will assemble in the spring in Philadelphia to once and for all go over and try to coordinate their actions. And will ultimately issue the very famous Declaration of Independence. Of course, this will be issued on July 4th of 1776. And there's a number of things that we don't want to labor on it too much, but there's a number of points of contention in the Declaration of Independence. Most notably, what Jefferson is going to be the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, though he'll have input from the other delegates at the Continental Congress. And what Jefferson is mostly going to bring up as reference is John Locke's Second Treatise on Civil Government, which I've talked about extensively here. Okay, and the difference between rebellion and revolution. Jefferson is going to make the argument that by establishing what in the colonials' mind was a tyrannical government, by effectively strictly enforcing everything with the colonists, by cracking down on the colonists, the British had entered into rebellion against the contract, and therefore it was the Americans' right and duty and obligation to revolt against them. Okay? And so they saw it as their duty. What we always have to keep in the back of our mind is the people, and they've gone down in American history as patriots, but we have to remember that they are all rebels. They are all, every one of them, George Washington, Adams, Hancock, all of the members of the Continental Congress are committing an act of treason. If they're caught, they will all be strung up and hung. okay, because they're committing an act of treason. We want to keep that in mind. I mean, in point of fact, we talked a little bit before about Benedict Arnold. When Benedict Arnold turncoats on the Continental Army and gives the plans to West Point to the British and becomes a British officer, that's actually his second act of treason. His first act of treason is joining the colonial army. That is in and of itself an act of treason, taking up arms against Great Britain. Now, the interesting thing is that when they come up with the Declaration of Independence, they decide that it has to be a unanimous decision. Okay? In other words, all 13 colonies have to go along with it. They all have to vote yes to declare their independence and declare a new republic, which they will do. There is contention on this, and each of the delegations has 3 members to it. Dickinson and Robert Morris and Ben Franklin make up, Robert Morris, our famous, not founder, but for whom we're named, make up the delegation from Pennsylvania. And Dickinson and Morris actually want to stay with Great Britain. They want to continue negotiations with Great Britain. They don't see rebellion as a viable option. Okay. Interestingly enough, Robert Morris will become the principal financier of the revolution, and that's one of the things. We may as well stop at that point because we're going to talk about this again when we get to the Articles of Confederation. Robert Morris, as a result, goes down in history as a great patriot, having financed the Revolutionary War. But we need to keep in mind a couple of things. One, during the negotiations of the Declaration of Independence, Robert Morris objected to a revolution. He didn't want a revolt. He didn't want the rebellion. And 2, Robert Morris profited from the revolution. He made huge amounts of money off financing the revolution. If he was truly a patriot, wouldn't he have given them the money for free? Wouldn't he have financed the revolution at his own expense? No. So he made huge amounts of money off of it. And that's probably how Franklin finally talked him into going along with it, is he said, "Hey, Bobby, baby, what you can do is you can take your vast wealth, you can help finance this war, and make a huge amount of money when the loan is paid back in interest." So he loans money to the Continental Army. But at any rate, that's the Declaration of Independence. We've talked a little about this already. We talked about Bunker Hill, which is Breed's Hill, which is June 1775. And here you see the actual link that will take you directly to the tactical analysis of Bunker Hill, which, as I said, is really quite fascinating. Now, Washington arrives in Boston just in time for the British to evacuate. The British are evacuating Boston as Washington arrives. The British make the decision to evacuate Boston because they come to the conclusion that, lacking control of Dorchester Heights in the south, their fleet is vulnerable to the guns of Ticonderoga, which have by now arrived outside of Boston, and therefore it's an untenable position. So they'll fall back to Nova Scotia. When they fall back to Nova Scotia, Howe will take over. William Howe will take over. The early commanders are William Howe is in command of the British ground force, and his brother Richard Howe is in command of the British fleet. And they begin to hatch the first real British strategy. See, one of the things, and it's not talked about very much, but as we go through this, we're going to look at some of the reasons why it is that the Americans prevail in the conflict. One of them comes to us directly from Sun Tzu's Art of War. Okay? The British, as we've talked about before, okay, the British have a tendency to look at the Americans as country bumpkins. Okay? So they underestimate both the strength of resolve of the rebellion and the ability of the American forces. Okay? Now, this is going to be demonstrated. This is demonstrated both at Lexington and Concord and at the area of Bunker Hill. It's now beginning to dawn on them that this conflict, which at first really, when the British first approached this, they saw this as a loose connection of a handful of disgruntled malcontents in New England who were instigating this insurrection, and it would not last very long. Now they're beginning to see that there is actually some resolve on the part of the Americans. There is some organization, and so they're going to have to take the effort a little more seriously, which is why they put William Howe in command. In Nova Scotia, he prepares his forces. The beginning of his operation, Boston is an untenable position. They decide instead to swing around with an amphibious assault and take New York. Now, Washington has fallen back to New York with approximately 10,000 men. He is in a strategically advantageous position in a series of forts on Manhattan Island. Okay? General Howe, William, will arrive with 10,000 men onto Staten Island. His brother will bring the fleet with an additional 15,000 men to reinforce the position. When William Howe arrives with his 10,000 men, Washington doesn't do a thing. Washington has an advantageous position here on Manhattan Island, but it's out of range of Staten Island. Howe will then cross onto Long Island. Again, the strategic advantage is Washington's. Washington has the high ground. He has the strategically advantageous position in a series of forts on Manhattan Island. He will do nothing to oppose the Howe brothers landing the British Army on Long Island. He will then do nothing as they cross onto Manhattan Island. Washington instead just simply sits and watches them take up a strategic position on Manhattan. Then Washington will move. Okay, so this is fairly typical of what we see with Washington. He begins this engagement, okay, with a strategic and tactical advantage, and he absolutely squanders it by not doing a thing. Okay, he could have opposed William Howe landing in the first place, and he certainly could have opposed, by the time really Richard came with the 15,000 reinforcements, he really was not in a position to oppose anymore. He had by that point squandered his tactical advantage. And in two sharp contests, the first being the battle for Brooklyn Heights, which takes place right here, and Washington's forces are here in a strategically advantageous position, which he will squander, and then fall back to Manhattan, and then he'll watch the Howes land on Manhattan, and then fight the Battle of White Plains up here, and be forced into an all-out retreat across the state of New Jersey, while the British take up a strategically advantageous position in New York. So again, this is Washington's first engagement, and it runs effectively exactly the same as the preceding engagements we've seen Washington participate in, which were in the French and Indian War. And so he's forced into a general retreat. Okay. After the Battle of New York, Washington will take what remains of his army, which is at this point a splintered force, and reassemble it and fall into full retreat across the state of New Jersey into Pennsylvania, where he'll take up a position just north of Philadelphia, which at that point is the capital of the Continental Congress. This is going to be one of the points for which Howe is going to be sharply criticized. That he fails to adequately pursue Washington's force. It's a little unfair, because in fact he does, and he takes up positions all throughout New Jersey. What the British are going to do is they're going to pull up to just to the other side of Philadelphia. They're going to be on the other side of the Delaware River from Philadelphia. And you have to know a little bit of the geography. We'll look at it later on, and I'll go back and explain this a little bit better when we see the actual geography. Trenton is just across the river from Princeton, across the Delaware River. The British will take up positions there, and Howe will build a series. He will have a series of garrisons across the state of New Jersey, leading from Trenton, New Jersey, all the way up to New York. Okay, and they'll be lightly defended. They'll have anywhere from 800 to 1,500 men in each garrison, in an effort to maintain his communication and logistical support line between his position in New Jersey, in Trenton, and the British headquarters in New York. Okay, for Washington's part, he's now west of the Delaware River with an army that is literally splintering apart. Okay, it has been months now. This is 1776. It has been since before the Battle of New York that any of these troops have been paid. Okay, they are beleaguered. They are running short of supplies, and his army is in danger of mutiny. Okay, of turning tail and disintegrating entirely. And so, in one of the more masterful engagements that Washington is going to undertake, he's going to cross the Delaware River. Okay, now he'll do this by surprise. Typically speaking, in 18th century warfare, there were no campaigns during the winter. Okay, when it was cold and the snow was out there, it was too difficult to maneuver troops. Okay, so the British had taken up a defensive position in Trenton for the winter of 76-77, with this series of garrisons leading back to New York. They figured the Americans would be in their defensive position through the winter of 76-77, and the war would recommence in the spring of 77. Washington surprises them, and on Christmas Day crosses the Delaware. Now, Washington has to do this because the troops that he has under his command signed a contract, and we really didn't get into the details of how the Colonial Army is assembled and how it works, but effectively recruits. And actually, we found when my wife was going through and looking up all the stuff from my family history, she found a letter commending a Lieutenant Honeywell for his recruitment. He had recruited a number of men. Well, when they would recruit, they would be paid approximately $12 a month, okay, to serve in the Colonial Army for a period of 1 year. That was their, tenure. Well, the guys that Washington had under his command had signed their agreement on January 1 of 1776. They hadn't been paid for the last 4 months. They were close to mutinying. Their contract was running out. Their term of service was running out. And so Washington was concerned that when their contracts were over on the 1st of January of 1777, they were all going to leave. Okay, which in point of fact, they probably would have. So Washington needed desperately something to give these poor guys hope. And so he's going to launch this desperate operation with about 3,500 men and cross the Delaware River. Now, he'll cross the Delaware River and surprise the British. He'll launch an attack against a very lightly defended position that the British have in Trenton. About 1,500 men, so he outnumbers them 2-1, and will overwhelm them. He'll then march north and overwhelm an even lighter defended position, about 1,000 men, in Princeton, New Jersey. But by the time he tries to move further north to take out more of the British garrisons, by that point Howe has marched south. Okay, he's gotten word of what Washington's doing, and Washington is not moving particularly quickly. Why is he not moving particularly quickly? Because he's moving in the middle of winter. It's impossible. You're dealing with thick snow. Okay, so he's moving very slowly, both in the taking of Trenton and in the taking of Princeton. Okay, as a result of this slow movement, Howe is able to assemble enough forces to come down and relieve the garrisons running from Trenton up to New York. And so in the next engagement, Washington's going to be outnumbered, and he actually won't have an engagement. He'll simply, when he sees Howe's army approaching, he'll simply abandon the position, march north, and then back across the Delaware. The British will retake immediately Princeton and Trenton. So it's a very short-lived victory. It's not by any means tactically or strategically decisive. It's not by any means tactically or strategically significant. It is significant in terms of a moral victory for the Americans. Okay? And so Washington manages to keep his army assembled through the winter of 76 and 77. The British, for their part, the reason that Howe hasn't invested serious forces down in southern New Jersey with the interest of taking Philadelphia and pursuing Washington's army across the Delaware again is because they're planning an operation in the Hudson Valley. The basic plan, and we'll go over it in a minute here, the basic plan is for the British to march an army from their position in Canada under Burgoyne south along the Hudson River and retake Fort Ticonderoga, and to march north from New York along the Hudson and pincer the American forces in the Hudson Valley and the Adirondacks. And once the British forces have linked up, they have effectively cut off New England. Okay, remember, the British are still under the impression that, and perhaps correctly, that the main instigation for this entire revolution is in New England. If you cut the rest of the colonies off from New England, they'll wither and die. They'll go away. They'll stop the revolution. Okay, and you see here the link to History Animated that gives you this, and this is the battle, ultimately the campaign of Saratoga. Now, as I just mentioned, here is the basic idea. The British are going to march down from Canada along Lake Champlain and retake Ticonderoga. They will send part of their force, and this is the force we've been looking at. These are the garrisons along New Jersey, or all through here. Howe will send an additional force north to assist Burgoyne, and then they'll launch under St. Leger a decoying force here to take American positions in the western Adirondacks. And this is literally just a decoy. This is just to distract the Americans, to force them to take some of their forces away so that Burgoyne's efforts in the north in the Hudson will be easier. The problem lies with this guy here, Germain. Germain is the main architect of this offensive. And it's a good plan. It's certainly a strategically sound plan. But Germain's plan is for Burgoyne to march south from Canada and take Ticonderoga, and for Howe to send part of his force north from New York to assist Burgoyne. The problem is that the order for Howe to march north and assist Burgoyne never gets to Howe. It's never issued. Okay, Germain, in haste, literally jumps into a carriage to go to a meeting and never sends the order to Howe. Howe is often sharply criticized for not assisting Burgoyne in his offensive in the Hudson. Well, the fact is, Howe received no orders to so do. Okay, so he stayed in New York. And ultimately, it's going to be, the British will successfully retake Fort Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga will be abandoned. The main operational American forces will be under the command of Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Gates will abandon Ticonderoga because he realizes it's an untenable position. He's concerned that the British will reinforce and ultimately encircle Ticonderoga, which is right here at the base of Fort Champlain. So the Americans will withdraw. Burgoyne will attempt to continue to march south. And the problem is that, as I've mentioned before, the British will underestimate two things. They will underestimate the abilities of Gates and Arnold to command, and they will underestimate the difficulty of the terrain in the northern Hudson River Valley, okay, and in the Adirondack Mountains. More than anything else, it's the terrain that defeats Burgoyne. By the time Burgoyne reaches Ticonderoga, okay, his army is already running short of supplies. To his credit, Schuyler, who is in charge of the actual defense of Ticonderoga, when he withdraws from Ticonderoga, does so in good order and takes everything with him. So when Burgoyne takes Fort Ticonderoga, it doesn't give him the supplies he desperately needs to maintain the operation. And so it's at best a Pyrrhic victory. He continues to march south. Now, Burgoyne is anticipating reinforcements arriving from Howe in New York, which of course will never materialize. So by the time Burgoyne begins the Saratoga campaign, and there will be a series of rather sharp engagements outside of Saratoga, which I encourage you to look at on the History Animated site, By then, his army is already disintegrating. They're short on supplies, short on ammunition, and so his army is already disintegrating. The St. Leger attack was successful at first. It served exactly what its purpose was. It was a decoy, but the Americans sent out reinforcements, and St. Leger was forced to withdraw from his positions in western New York and go back to Canada. And so Burgoyne now stands alone and is rapidly encircled by a series of American militias. And so ultimately, he'll be forced to surrender his position. Okay, and so the operation, the overall objective will fail. The British will fail at this, and this was the first major strategic victory for the Americans. It will turn, in fact, the course of the war. Because most significantly, what's going to happen as a result of it is the French are going to enter the war on the side of the Americans. But it is a strategic defeat, and interestingly enough, in the first major strategic victory for the Americans, both tactical and strategic victories for the Americans, George Washington is nowhere in sight. George Washington is some 700 miles south, having turned tail and run and retreated across the state of New Jersey, and now in a position across the Delaware River. And so he's nowhere to be found, which is actually, I mean, kind of parenthetically, I might add, which is probably why the Americans won the contest. If Washington had been involved in this, he would have somehow found a way to screw it up. Because that's what George did. He found a way to screw it up at Fort Necessity. He found a way to screw it up at Monongahela. He found a way to screw it up in New York. He found a way to screw it up in the little campaign he was launching in New Jersey, and certainly had he been involved here, he would have found some way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. That's probably a little unfair, but actually it's not a little unfair, it's true. Okay? And so the British will have to abandon this operation. In the post script to the battle of to the campaign of Saratoga, as I mentioned, Burgoyne is forced to surrender most of his army. He himself will be ransomed back to the British and will go back to Canada. But this is the first time that the American forces have acquitted themselves well against the British. It will be a strategic victory for the Americans. The most significant thing that comes out of this is it demonstrates to France, who is looking for some, we should probably mention, is looking for some get even, right? Because the French lost against the British in the 7 Years' War and lost against them in the French and Indian War and were forced to abandon their position in Canada. We remember that, right? The Battle of Plains of Abraham, the French. So the French are looking for some get even here. This gives the French an opportunity to get some get even on the British. Okay, the Americans have now demonstrated that given the correct circumstances, they can actually prevail. And so France and Spain will form the League of Armed Neutrality and begin to assist the Americans. The French will begin to send troops to America in the fall of 77. Okay? And so they'll begin to support the American position. Most importantly, or perhaps one of the more important things, they'll send a fleet over that will, under de Grasse, which will originally harass British shipping in the West Indies and disrupt their logistical supply lines, but ultimately will prove decisive in the Battle of the Capes, the Virginia Capes, which we'll see here in a little while. Okay? Spain will join the alliance in June of 79. They don't really have that much of an impact on things, although they'll be there with their hand out in the Peace of Paris when the war ends. And just kind of to conclude what will be part A of the Lecture on the Revolution, you know, I've been dividing these things so that they go 45 to 50 minutes. There will be a series of engagements now in the South. What Howe's going to do is now press the issue against Washington in eastern Pennsylvania, and in a series of sharp engagements, drive Washington westward and capture Philadelphia. And it's in the spring of 78, and Washington will be forced to winter at Valley Forge, and we'll talk about that in greater detail when we pick this up in Part B, and we'll talk about those sharp engagements as well. and in the spring of '78, Howe will be replaced as commander of British forces by Clinton. And Clinton will come to the conclusion that given the length of the logistical supply line and the communications line between Philadelphia and New York, this is a vulnerable position. And so he'll evacuate Philadelphia and move back to New York. And Washington will attempt unsuccessfully to pursue him. And again, we'll deal with that in greater detail when we pick this up in Part B.